Hey everybody, Eric from Green Eye Tactical. Wanted to do a quick video about a topic that's it keeps popping up over the years here with me, and it's come up recently as well on some forums and Facebook pages and whatnot. So I wanted to do a real quick video. This isn't going to be a crazy production. It's well, it's about 2:30 in the morning right now. This is when I usually get up, so I just kind of slap my camera and stuff up in the office and covered up my door to the front room there, just so I could put this out. I'm not going to do any fancy picture-in-picture stuff, so I just slapped together some slides on a PowerPoint, so we can see some graphics here. So I apologize if this isn't better production quality, but I just kind of wanted to put something out here real quick and get some thoughts. So what this topic is that usually comes up, it usually starts with a question, right? And that question is, what distance should I zero my AR-15 at? And there's a lot of different ideas being put out there, techniques, types of zeros. You'll have to excuse my coffee drinking. It's early, so I need to get my coffee intake up. So it starts with that question. So I kind of wanted to drill down into that a little bit. This isn't necessarily to call anyone out. But I do want to call out some facts and some myths and principles. And hey, if you've got different ideas, you can feel free to post in the comments and we'll talk about it. So moving on here, let's talk about zeroing. And again, sorry, if this is hard to see, I'm just trying to put some stuff together here with some graphics that I already have for other classes and whatnot. So when we talk about zeroing, right, there's a few different aspects that we need to agree on first. So the first thing are the three different axes that we need to be concerned with, right? I'm just going to kind of point over here at the TV. So the first one, this black line, I don't know if it looks black or blue in the camera or not, that's going to be your line of sight. So your uncorrected line of sight parallel to the ground directly towards your target line, right? That's your line sight picture, your head and eye line behind the optic, looking straight out there. It's a straight line. The next thing is going to be the blue line, which is the line of bore axis, whatever you want to talk about it. Just think as if you put a laser inside of that barrel and it's perfectly collimated to the barrel and aligned to it, and it's shooting straight out. It's uncorrected to the sights right now, and it's parallel to the ground. Right? It would, if it was completely parallel to the ground, just like the sights were, it should be aimed right at the target, spaced within the height over bore, which is another aspect we need to talk about, which is or sight height, whatever you prefer to call it. It's the vertical height that the sight is above the axis of bore, and it is a critical measurement that you need, and they're different on some setups here. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is this yellow line, and that's the bullet trajectory. Now, what this is uncorrected bullet trajectory. So it's just like if you had the barrel that was completely parallel to the Earth, or more appropriately, perpendicular to the axis of gravity. That bullet is going to begin dropping as soon as it leaves support of the barrel. So gravity is always affecting the round, even when it's in its casing, even when it's in the magazine. Gravity is always trying to accelerate it towards the Earth. So as soon as it leaves the barrel, it begins dropping. Bullets do not have any lift properties. Okay, some people brought up, well, what about aerodynamic jump? Well, that's something else. Okay, and I don't want to get too deep into some of these topics. I do in some of the classes. But I just kind of want to give broad strokes here so, we get enough information out there that you understand some of these concepts. So the bullet begins dropping as soon as it leaves the barrel. Now, the bullet drop, right? One thing to kind of make sure you've got your head wrapped around that is all bullets drop at the same speed. They all drop at the same rate. The difference is velocity, time of flight. So the time it took you to get from here to there. Right, so if you took two bullets in your hand of completely different grain weights, different ballistic coefficients, whatever, and dropped them, they're all going to hit the ground at the same time, right? So as it moves out, it begins to slow down, and the drop's going to increase as we go out there because it's covering less distance, right, for the time that it's traveling. Does that kind of make sense? So that's why you get more increased drop. So that's really what's causing your drop. It's gravity and time of flight. All right, and there's a number of other factors we'll get into here, but those are the kind of broad strokes. So getting into the zeroing process, we know that our bullets aren't hitting the ground in front of the target, or we hope they don't. What we're really doing is we're re-referencing the sights, right? So we're using the sights to reference where the barrel's pointed, and we'll modify where that sight appears to us by adjusting it and causing the rifle to incline, depress, skew left or right, whatever we need to do. But the axes are going to remain the same, right? So we've got our corrected line of sight that's still moving out towards the target, and the correction in the line of sight has caused us to bring the barrel up. Now, obviously, this isn't to scale. You're not angling the barrel up that far. It's just so you can see it, right? You're still getting the bullet falling away, down, towards gravity from the axis of bore as soon as it leaves the barrel. So even though the bullet is coming up towards your line of sight, it's still falling away from your line of bore as soon as it leaves support of the barrel. Okay? That's something important to understand. It's also important to understand if you're going to do some laser bore lighting, figure out offset zeros, because the bullet trajectory is going to be different than what your line of bore is, depending on what distance you're doing it at. So it's falling away. Now, traditional zeros, and we'll get into some of these, for ARs are usually going to have two intersects. People call these different names, right? You just don't want to get too wrapped around the axle. It's going to pass through your line of sight twice, usually, for most zeros that people set up. They may call them the near intersect and the far intersect, right? Near zero, far zero, whatever. It doesn't really matter. The other aspect that you're going to want to understand is the maximum ordinate, or the apogee of the round. The highest that the round is going to get over your line of sight. So at some point, it's going to pass through your line of sight, move up, right? And it's going to get above your line of sight, and then it's going to move down, right? And then it's going to be below. Kind of makes sense? And this is just kind of showing a 25-300, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But just want to make sure we're kind of clear on those different parts of the zero and how that's working, right? For most of you guys, you probably already know this, but it's always good to cover it. So, getting back to that fundamental question, which zero should I use, right? Now, before I get into that, I'll drink some coffee here. Before I get into that, let's talk about the common zeros that are pushed out in the industry, right? So, these are standard zeros, right? So we've got the 25-300. Which is a standard military doctrine zero. I'm pretty familiar with it. Hey, I'm ex-military as well. And we get a lot of guys that are in the military, coming out in the industry and teaching. So we tend to teach what we know, right? Even though sometimes we may not completely understand the reasons behind it, right? Now, there is a specific process to that, and it depends on what different weapon system you're using in the military. Right, because there's different, especially with iron sights, there's different drum adjustments, there's different offset targets, right? And it's because we've got labs and people in the Department of Defense that they figure out all the gee whiz stuff for you. So Joe Snuffy doesn't have to worry about that. He follows instructions, zeros as he's told to, and moves on, right? Because he's got a lot of other stuff to worry about at that time. So the other one is going to be the 5200. Which is pretty popular in the industry here. I get a lot of guys that are told, like, hey, you should zero your rifle at 50, and understand that, hey, I'm kind of crossing between meters and yards, which it's going to happen because in the civilian industry here, or even law enforcement, a lot of times we're talking about yards, right? In the military, these zeros are at meters. Right, unless I believe the Marine Corps modifies their 25-300 to a 36-yard zero to accommodate for the Z-stop on the or the difference in trajectory, because 25-300 is not, if you zero at 25 for a military zero, it's not exactly at 300, but if you zero at 300, it's not exactly at 25. So I think they do 36. I don't pay too much attention to what the Marines do. I love you guys though. So 5200, I believe that was if my history is right, that was a Marine Corps officer that came up with it, the Santos modified zero. But it's pushed out, in the industry quite a bit. The theory is like, hey, if you're 50, 200, right? You zero at 50, you're on at 200, right? And the other third most popular one is going to be the 100-yard zero, right? Now, if guys are using scopes, this could be at 100 yards or 100 meters. And the reason for that is so that all the turret corrections and reticle subtensions are going to match up, and you're not going to have to do a hold under excessively at closer distances, which if you zero at farther distances, you may actually have to do a hold under instead of a hold over, which kind of changes how we're doing things a little bit. But it's also being pushed out in the tactical industry as well, so that guys don't have to worry too much about holds and stuff out to 100. You're just center holding out to 100, barring CQB holdover at close distances, and then just holdovers past there, right? So it's kind of being pushed out on both sides, whether it's a scoped optic or a tactical rifle, right? So these are standard zeros, right? Now, before I kind of deep dive into these a little bit, let's talk about some things that are going to affect. Because remember that standard word, standard zero, right? Or here say principles or whatever people want to call it. Factors that are going to affect your zero, right? Now, there's different ways to break this out. I just kind of threw it into three different categories that kind of make sense to me. You've got your ammunition, your rifle, and your environment, your weather, right? Those are your three main factors. Now, granted, we're just doing the mechanical portion of the zero. We're not really talking about fundamentals right now, right? We're talking about mechanically matching your trajectory to your optic and making your corrections, right? Fundamentals is a whole nother ball of wax. But those are the three main categories that I've kind of split out there: ammunition, rifle, and environment. We'll drill those down here a little bit. So with the ammunition, what the chief thing that we need to worry about here is velocity, right? And there's things that are going to affect the velocity. Some more coffee. It's still early. Remember what I said about time of flight, right? The velocity of the round is going to drastically affect your drop. There's things that are going to affect the velocity. Number one, the amount of propellant, what it's loaded with, right? Most civilian rounds are going to be spec to SAMI certifications, which is going to limit the chamber pressure that it's going to be able to push out. It's a voluntary thing. It's not mandatory. The NATO rounds are going to be completely different. They might run a little bit hotter. But they're also tested completely differently. It's very difficult to compare a listed chamber pressure for a NATO round off of that contract to a civilian one, because the testing process for that's different. The next thing is going to be the burn rate, fast versus slow. If you go and look on a lot of manufacturers' websites for propellant, and guys that reload know this, they're going to burn at different rates, and they're going to have pressure spikes at different rates, because really that's what we're doing. We're kind of causing an explosion, rapid expansion of gases with heat and pressure to push the round out, and these rounds are going to burn at different rates. Obviously, we wouldn't want just a huge pressure spike in the beginning. We're trying to accelerate that round out of the barrel and use the length of that barrel to our advantage, right? We're trying to push it as long as it's in the barrel for as long as we can and accelerate that round to the desired speed, right? So some are going to burn faster, slower. Some are going to have double pressure spikes, which if you look at some of the data there, you'll see some different formulations that'll have more than one pressure spike in the burn rate. But that's important to know. Another thing to note here is even though it's kind of vogue in the industry, there is no true SBR optimized ammunition on the market. And we're going to get into barrel length here in a minute. I've got a lot of data on ammunition, just due to the nature of my tactical rifle fundamentals course and a lot of my other courses. We do data collection, and we figure out the best zeros for guys' rifles. And I've got a computer full of collected velocity data on different types of rounds and things like that. And I've yet to see a round that's truly SBR optimized. You think shorter barrel, it's got to have a really fast burn rate, and you can get higher pressures for that. It's gonna create more. Just physics. You need more energy, right? Because you need energy to move mass, and if you need to move mass to a set speed in a shorter distance, you need more energy. It just happens, right? There are some rounds that do perform better. I get better velocity out of some shorter barrels, but I wouldn't call it a true SBR optimized round. Now there's some other special operations rounds that are out there, but a manufacturer that does it doesn't even admit that they make it. It's a Jsoc only round, so you're not going to get that. So good luck. The next thing is going to be powder temperature. Right, so powder temperature is going to affect velocity. Remember, I said that powder, that propellant that's in the casing there, gets ignited by the primer and starts that rapid expansion of gases. And different powder formulations are going to be sensitive to different temperature bands. Right, just common sense. If that powder starts at a lower temperature, it's going to have a different burn characteristic than if it starts at a higher temperature. Kind of makes sense, and you can easily see that on the range if you're doing data collection. Like I've got a lab radar right here, where you can take a magazine of ammo, stick it in a cooler, right? Cool it off really well, and you can get pretty cheap like little laser heat register thermal guns or whatever on Amazon for like $19. They're gonna be super accurate. But you'll get an idea what the temperature is, and if you can get that internal pressure down, because it's internal, not the casing temperature, but the actual powder temperature inside. You get that down, and then take another magazine and have it laying out in the hot sun, like maybe in the summer, and then real quickly you shoot them, side by side here, and test the ammunition. You'll see different velocities, right? That's going to happen. Generally, you're going to see faster velocities in hotter temperature and lower velocities in colder temperature. But the thing to understand is that powder temperature isn't linear, and I've seen this kind of put out. On forums and things like that, where people say like, hey, you're going to get X amount of velocity per degree. Okay, and the problem is they don't represent that as a general rule. They say generally, but it's going to vary. They don't say that. They'll say, you're going to get X amount of feet per second per degree. That's not true. Powder temperature is not linear, right? It's some people call it a bell curve. It's more of an S curve. You're going to have some different sweet spots in there, and some powder is going to be more susceptible to temperature changes. Some's not going to be susceptible at all, or well, not at all, but less. Right? They're going to have sweet spots where they're going to be more or less sensitive. Right? The contract requirements for the DoD rounds for like. I think it's XM193 or the M193 and M855. I believe it's at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's where it's supposed to have its sweet spot. But they're all going to have different bands. The only way to do that is to actually test it and see where it is, right? Unless the manufacturer is going to give that information out to you. But I tend not to trust all information given out by manufacturers because they're selling you a product, right? So that whole trust but verify, I just don't trust and verify anyways. Powder temperature, not linear. It's going to affect velocity. Next thing is going to be bullet mass, right? So why does bullet mass affect the bullet velocity? Well, remember, we said we're creating energy to move mass. So the more mass an object has, the more energy it takes to accelerate it. Right, so if you had a 62 grain round and a 50 grain round, or a 70 and a 50, right, it's going to take more energy to accelerate the higher grain round than it is going to be the lower one. That's just common physics. It takes energy to accelerate mass, so that can and will affect your velocity, right? Ballistic coefficient. So ballistic coefficient is something that's going to have more effect once it leaves the barrel. The ballistic coefficient is kind of summarized as a numerical representation from a formula that's going to describe or display the bullet's efficiency at passing through that column of air in front of you or downrange, right? It's also variable on velocity, right? So that's something else important to understand. The ballistic coefficient of the round actually changes as the velocity changes. And it's going to be different for every round. Generally, you'll start to see an increase in efficiency as it accelerates up to a certain point. Of course, if it accelerates too much, it's going to go ahead and start to destabilize. It could, based off the twist rate. And then it's going to drop off, and it's going to do some funny things in the transonic barrier as well. But it's variable on velocity. So that's important to understand, because usually when you pick up your box, or you look of ammo, or you look on the manufacturer's website, it's going to have one number. And you got to be real careful trusting that number on the manufacturer's website, because there have been manufacturers who've been kind of caught out being a little generous with their ballistic coefficients. Higher ballistic coefficients better, lower is worse, and not everybody wants to sell a product that's going to be worse. Right, that's just kind of common sense, right? So those words are kind of hard to see, aren't they? We'll see if we can bring it up here and post edit a little bit. So amount of propellant, burn rate, powder temperature, bullet mass, ballistic coefficient, right? There's really good solutions for ballistic coefficients. One of the great tools that I use are the applied ballistics tools. They'll have custom drag curves for a lot of bullets that are out there, because they've gone out there with either Doppler or whatever high speed stuff they've got, and figured out what the precise drag curve is for the round as it passes through different velocity gates. So that's really helpful. And there's also ways to true up your ballistic coefficient based off of time of flight to target, and truing up your drops and things like that, which are going to require some decent fundamental skills to be able to group consistently and without major error. All right, so moving on. Rifle. So I already mentioned sight height. Sight height's important. Now, I have seen some people on the interwebs, like, oh, hey, because they see, kind of ex-special operations guys, like me, or different guys out in the industry. We tend to run our optics up on a riser, and there's multiple reasons for that. It does make it easier to get in the prone, especially a low prone. I have a less angled position. My head's more vertical. I can get the buttstock in more centerline for CQB, which frees up more deflection towards my firing side, especially when I'm moving laterally towards my non-firing side, and different things like that. And it helps a few things, but one of the other things it helps is it helps keep my head vertical and upright behind the rifle, which is important with night vision, right? Because you can't glance through night vision tubes. We have to keep those tubes aligned if we're going to use our optic, right? So there's a lot of different reasons for that. And I've seen some guys out in the industry like, oh, you're going to have problems with the launch angle. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, what, are you making stuff up here? Maybe you're just assuming that if I've got a 3 3/4 inch height over bore, that I'm going to zero it at the same distance as a guy with a 2.5 inch height over bore. Yeah, I'm going to have some issues then, but that would be stupid. I wouldn't do that. I'd do the math and figure out the best distance to zero it out, and it's actually going to have some added gains here, which I'll talk about here in a minute with regards to pushing out my zero. So sight height is critical because you're referencing your sights to your barrel. So the amount of angle that you're pushing to get out there based off of velocity and bullet drop, matching up the absolute bullet drop to the sight height and figuring out where we can get it to go out to is going to be important. Next thing is going to be barrel length. Right? Now, barrel length isn't something that you're going to put into a ballistic calculator, but it's something important to consider and understand. Right? Guys who are running an 18-inch barrel, 16-inch barrel, 14.5-inch barrel, 10.4, 10.5, or whatever flavor you're running in the day, you're going to get different velocities, right? Remember we talked about those burn rates. Most of those velocities that you're going to see on the ammunition boxes that you get from manufacturers, they're going to be tested out of 20-inch blank barrel. I have seen some that show some test results out of a 14.5-inch and things like that, but generally we're going to get better velocity out of longer barrels. So as we get shorter, right, that burn rate of that powder is tuned for a certain time, right? We want it to burn a certain time to maximize the amount of energy to push that round out of the barrel. Because if it burned too quick, right, then you're going to get friction in the barrel that's going to decelerate the round before it leaves. That would be bad. If it's too slow with the burn rate, that powder is still going to be expanding after that bullet leaves the barrel, and then you're just going to get unburnt powder out of the end of the barrel that's pushed out, or just big muzzle flashes, right? And that's why when guys are shooting super, SBRs, these 10-inch barrels, you get big muzzle flashes and things like that. That's propellant still expanding after the bullet's already left. And when you shoot longer barrels, you don't quite get that so much, right? So there's a balancing act, and they're all different, right? So those are just things to consider when you're dropping down to an SBR. Make sure you understand what you're getting for what you're giving up. I'm not going to say right or wrong. It's going to depend off of your requirements and your needs, right? Or for some people, wants, All right, next thing is going to be twist rate. Now, your twist rate does affect your velocity, right? It's more for the stability of the round. Like, we want a certain twist rate to be able to stabilize the round as it goes out. Military barrels will often run 1 and 7 inches, but that's mainly for heavier grain like tracer rounds and different things like that you don't usually see out in the industry here. 1 and 8, even 1 and 9, is fine depending on what type of ammo you're running out here. But with that, I pulled an actual study that Litz did with Applied Ballistics, and if you don't have these books or been to one of their seminars, I'd highly recommend it. Don't be intimidated by how thick these books are. They're written in common terms that are easy to understand. You can kind of read through it and get a better understanding of what we're talking about. But I pulled up one of the studies that he did, and granted, this wasn't with a 5.56 round. This was with a different caliber round. But they actually showed that you can get a 1.33 feet per second change per inch of twist that you've added to a barrel. So it's minor, but they also showed that it will actually affect your ballistic coefficient due to gyroscopic stability as well, right? How much the round's going to wobble or yaw through the air is going to affect its efficiency moving through the air, right? So it's a pretty interesting study. If you Google it, you can figure it out. But it's a minor effect, but it can happen, right? Next thing is going to be environment, right? So when we talk about environment, now we're getting into, to some extent, external ballistics, but it can be back to powder temperature as well, right? With the ambient air pressure, or ambient air temperature, how it's going to affect those round casings, right? And how hot or cold they're going to get, right? But when we get into this, we're really talking about the column of air that the bullet's passing through, right? So we mentioned the ballistic coefficients. It's a numerical representation of the round's efficiency of passing through that air mass, because air is going to cause drag. It's going to cause resistance for it to pass through. So the density and composition of that air mass is going to affect its ability to pass through. It's going to affect how wind drift's going to affect it, based off of all that, and how much drop we're going to get. So first thing, barometric pressure. And wait, somebody's probably squirming in their seats right now. Barometric pressure is a generally known term. Most people know what barometric pressure is, right? Because when you go to your weather apps, that's what it's pulling, right? Most of your weather stations are, they may be doing that. But here's the thing: what barometric pressure is it's pressure corrected to sea level. Your bullet does not care what the pressure at sea level is. It doesn't. It cares what the pressure is where you are, where that round's going to be fired from, and where it's traveling to, right? So what we really want is the uncorrected pressure, which is station pressure. And that's something important to understand. If you're using ballistic calculators or, your Kestrels or whatever, make sure you're using uncorrected pressure. And usually with your Kestrels, if you see a reference altitude there, you're using corrected. You want it uncorrected. Make sure you understand that if you're just kind of looking up a weather app or whatever, because weathermen use barometric pressure because it's comparative. You've got a constant there with sea level, so you can compare different regions' pressure for weather patterns. So station pressure, right? Next thing is going to be air temperature, right? Hotter air tends to be less dense. Colder air tends to be more dense. Wind speed, right? Now, wind speed, we generally think of that as wind drift, but it can also affect our drops, especially if we're getting a straight 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock wind, right? If the wind's moving towards us, right, that's more drag. It's passing through more air as it moves out, and it's going to have more of an effect on the ballistic coefficient, cause it to drop sooner because it's going to slow down. Even though it's passing through the same amount of air, that mass of air is moving. So its airspeed is different than the ground speed, and we're really kind of looking at ground distance covered for drops, not air distance. The next thing is going to be humidity. All right, so all those factors are going to go in there that are going to come up with a solution. A lot of your solvers will come up with the density, altitude, and other factors, and it'll be done for you. A lot of them are automated. And if you really want to get into the math of it, of how to do all the math yourself, there's plenty of resources out there. I'm not really going to deep dive this right now. Just want to kind of cover the main aspects so everyone understands, right? So that's a lot of variables, right? We had 3 different categories, and there was multiple variables in there that's going to affect your zero, the ballistic trajectory, right? So really want to think about that. How many of you guys are all shooting the same rifle, the same ammunition, the same sight setup, right? And when we say same ammunition, that doesn't mean 5.56 or 2.23, right? All of it is not the same, right? And we're going to get into that here in a minute. But they're all different, right? So what's going to be different? Your drops, right? So how much does it matter? I want to talk about drops. I hope you guys can see that there. Yeah, it should be. If not, I'll try to darken it up here in post. How much does that matter? These are numbers here from my last class that I did. I'm going to tilt this light down real quick. That looked like it helped out a little bit there. So these are the numbers from the last class that I did, where we did some zeroing. And these aren't all the rifles. I just kind of pulled some select ones because some of it gets a little repetitive. And what we've got here is a number of different rifles, 16-inch barrels, 10.5, 14.5-inch barrels. And I'm not going to go into the twist rates and stuff like that, because we're just going to talk about the muzzle velocity, because there's a lot of differences between these. But we're just going to talk about uncorrected drops at 300 yards for comparison, right? Now, when I do the collection, I use a lab radar here. It's a pretty good piece of kit. Now, understand, this isn't a rich man's game. Lab radars are nice. They're pretty accurate. I've got a pretty good amount of confidence in them, but you can get a cheap shooting crony from Bass Pro or Cabela's or whatever. Is it going to be as precise? No, but it's probably going to be more precise than the numbers on the box that you've got, because it's actually going to measure what you have. And it can be a little bit more finicky based off of light conditions, but you don't have to, drop, I don't know what these things are now, like $400 or $500, $600 or whatever. On a chronograph, you can get a cheaper one to pull this data and figure it out yourself. Right, or go in with a buddy, So, last class is uncorrected drop at 300 yards, right? So, the first group I've got here are 4 different rifles in the 16-inch flavors. These are 16-inch barrels, right? Now, the first 3 were all shooting XM193, right, which is a really popular round out in the industry, or load, that guys use. It's nice. It runs really hot. It's got a lot of velocity out of it, so it shoots kind of flat. It doesn't have as much drop out of distance. Of course, it's a lighter weight round, so you're going to start having some issues when you get out to distance. But it's a pretty good easy round to shoot for most ARs, because you're not having to worry about holds as much as larger 70 grain rounds. So the first one here we've got had an average muzzle velocity. It's the average muzzle velocity out of the lab radar of 3,012 feet per second. Now, the uncorrected drop, meaning barrels, we've zeroed out the zero distance. It's just a flat barrel. Is 27.314 inches, right? And the way we do this is I'll throw all this data into applied ballistics. and we'll throw in the drag curves and all this stuff, and all the weather and atmospherics. Which hey, oh, by the way, if you want something real cheaper than a high speed applied ballistics Kestrel, the Kestrel D3 drops are pretty good. You can get them for just a little over $100 on Amazon, and it just syncs to your phone via Bluetooth, and you get all the density, altitude, and all the different data that you need. But anyway, so back to this. So 27.314 inches at 300. Now this is uncorrected. Okay, so it hasn't been zeroed. This is just a barrel that's pointed perpendicular to the line of gravity, or parallel to the ground, right? Theoretically. Next one is another XM193 with an average velocity of 3,150 feet per second, and it had a absolute drop at 300 or uncorrected drop of 23 inches. And the third one was an average velocity of 3,027 feet per second, and it had a drop of 24.9 inches. Now, right off the bat, some guys are probably like, oh, those numbers don't add up. Why are they different? It's all the same ammunition. No, it wasn't. So you've got different manufacturers that make XM193, right? Not everybody's showing up with Federal, cast-offs, XM193. You'll have a number of different manufacturers that will call their ammo XM193. And guess what? You get different results. That's why the relationship towards the velocity and drop isn't the same, right? So it's just something to think about. We get different results with those things, right? Now, the next one that we've got here is a 55 grain Hornady, right? It was a Lake City Reloads, I believe, and they weren't too bad consistency wise, and it had an average velocity of 2782 feet per second with absolute calculated drop of 29 inches at 300. Right, so those are all 16-inch barrels. All have different drops out at 300. Right, so the total difference between the XM193, right? We're dealing with what? It's early math. Take a sip of coffee here before I do simple subtraction. 4.314 inches. Is that right? Maybe. Calculators over there. Then our 55, 29 inches. So hey, we're dealing with what? 7 inches? No, 6 inches. It's early. I'll drink more coffee or have a Monster or something. So a difference of 6 inches a drop between those two, right? So we're starting to get into some significant differences between drops, uncorrected drops at 300, right? And these are all 16-inch barrels, all running 5.56, loads or AR-15 loads, and people be like, oh, it's all the same. Oh yeah, you're shooting standardized ammunition. It's all 5.56. No, they're all different. Of course, the rifles were different manufacturers, slightly different twist rates, all different, right? Same class. Next one, we had a 10.5-inch barrel. This guy was running Black Hills 55 grain TSX. I don't think it was Black Hills. I think it was something else. I'd have to look. But it was 55 grain TSX. And it had an average muzzle velocity of 2,638 feet per second with an uncorrected drop at 300 of 31.6 inches, right? So now you're seeing a difference between SBRs and longer barrels, right? And that just is what it is. I didn't pull the data for it. We actually shot that 55 grain TSX out of a 16-inch barrel, and we were getting up around 29.8, like 2,980 feet per second. It was running pretty well out of a 16-inch, but when we got down to 10.5, it's getting some pretty good muzzle flashes. So 31.6 inches, right? Quite a bit more. Now, we got another one here, which is interesting, a 14.5-inch barrel. And I'm going to talk about this one on the next slide because it's an interesting kind of vignette for what we're talking about here to reinforce things. So this guy was running a round that's often popular in the law enforcement industry that I'm not a huge fan of, but it's 60 grain Hornady tap. I think it was their urban tap. it had an average muzzle velocity of 2,334 feet per second, with an uncorrected drop of 41.28 inches. Yeah, so quite a bit slower, right? Usually I don't expect to see those velocities unless it's out of an SBR. Now, granted, I didn't take time to inspect the barrel or anything like that. The standard deviation and extreme spread when we looked at it was pretty good. It was within tolerances, so we're all right. If you don't understand what standard deviation and extreme spread is with rounds, this will calculate it for you. Don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but that's pretty easy to Google and look up, and you'll get a good explanation for it. And it's another good corollary effect of a good chronograph is it allows you to test for the consistency of the ammo that you're buying, right? To make sure you're not buying kind of crap ammo, because a high extreme spread or standard deviation with your ammunition can induce vertical POI error at distance. Right, just because different velocity, different drop, right? So, the difference between the min and max drop off of those calculations is 18.28 inches, right? We're getting into the realm, if you're doing the whole high center mass, or minute of man, I don't know, whatever kind of stuff you're doing, where you could be missing a torso, definitely missing a headshot, right? Now, of course, people say like, oh, well, hey, if I'm aiming at the head and I'm low, I'm going to hit the body. Well, you're assuming a vertical guy, not a guy that's poking up over a wall or around a corner or something like that. Miss is going to be a miss at that point, right? And depending on how complicated the foreground and background is, and adjacency of non-hostiles, that can be a catastrophic event, right? So a little bit of a difference. So yeah, that's kind of interesting now, and we're talking about standard zeros. Right, 25-300, 50-200, right? Are you gonna tell me that all of these guys are gonna be on? So if we zero all these rifles at 50, they're gonna be on at 200. If we zero them all at 25, they're all gonna be on at 300. No, a lot of rifle setups, it's going to be mathematically impossible for them to intersect both at 50 and 200. Unless you start artificially changing the sight height to make that possible, to get that trajectory to happen, right? It isn't, right? Now, it also depends on what you're accepting, right? If you're accepting the good enough, right, then whatever. Why even call that a 50-200 zero? Right, zero means zero. I'm zero there. My point of aim equals my point of impact. Done. Right. You're not. It's not honest to call a rifle zeroed if you're accepting a minute of man accuracy. Right. I hit somewhere in this target, or hey, I hit the 60-inch gong at 300 yards. I'm zeroed. No, I'm not going to accept that. You can say I'm hitting in my acceptable aiming area, or my acceptable standard of accuracy at 300. That's fine, But yeah, I've got issues with people calling that a zero, right? Zero means zero, and they're all different. So let's move on here. And this is why I get so fired up about this. So if you're wondering why I'm on a rant about this, well, I don't want to call it a rant. I'm just trying to explain the data behind all this. This is why. So remember that 14.5-inch rifle? Well, that was a law enforcement duty weapon. That was an active serving law enforcement officer. And I see this happen all the time, right? And a lot of times they'll run 50-yard zeros because, number one, they were told 50-200 works. You should zero your rifle at 50, right? The NRA is bad about this too because, and it's not really their fault, but their law enforcement instructor program, their course of fire, their testing course of fire only goes out to 50. And the reason for that is a lot of law enforcement agencies, especially like local law enforcement agencies, don't have ranges they can shoot at that go past 50 yards. Some are lucky if they have a 50. So because of that, when the NRA made their law enforcement course testing standards, they only did it out to 50, because if they did it out to 100, 200, 300, you'd have a large portion of law enforcement agencies that couldn't even do the testing protocols. And a lot of law enforcement agencies themselves, their own internal tests only go out to 50. And I have run into some that they do shoot their rifles out farther. I do encourage that, because, hey, the enemy gets a vote at what distance that engagement occurs at, right? You don't always dictate the time and place for that engagement, right? And I'll hear people throw out, well, it's a CQB weapon. Well, hey, in Texas, our high schools here are pretty big. You can easily get a 200-yard internal shot in a central access corridor. I mean, hotels, a lot of hotels, you can push over 100 yards inside shopping malls. Hey, that's CQB, man. You can get up to 300-yard shots inside of a lot of malls, right? Enemy gets a vote. So let's get back to this LE duty weapon. So he was zeroed at 50 yards because that's what he was told to do, right? And he wasn't really ordered to. It was just like, hey, you're on here, right? So 5,200. He'd been carrying this for years, right? Fortunately, the first time he shot it out past 50 was during this course, right? So when I pulled the data for his ammunition, and we actually had good data on the tap rounds that was in the Applied Ballistics custom drag curves, and I usually trust that when it's in there. They've got good data on stuff. The calculated maximum ordnance, or the highest the round was getting over the line of sight for a 50-yard zero, was 0.69 inches. That's it. So you just over a half inch. Pretty negligible. Your ability to distinguish a half inch through an unmagnified optic at 90 yards is going to be pretty limited, anyways. I mean, your dot's going to be bigger. At 200 yards, right? Because that's where you're supposed to be zeroed, right? Zeroed at 50, zeroed at 200. Where the round was at 200 here, it was low, 4.64 inches, right? So, hey, about 4.5, 5 inches low at 200. That is putting you in the realm of missing a headshot. Now, some people might say, well, oh, that's pretty close. Well, the other thing you have to understand is you have to understand the multiplication of errors, right? The compounding effect of shooting errors. So if you get in the mindset, especially as a guy who's using this weapon as a profession, right? Because when I look at these weapons, I've got a sole focus. They are designed with the sole purpose of applying lethal force. That's it. Now, they're tweaked and used in different ways. They can be used for sporting, right? They can be used for hunting, even though that you're still applying lethal force, when you're hunting. They can be used for entertainment, but hey, I don't like thinking about them as being fun, because now you're getting into some issues with the heart of the firearm safety rule number 1. Treat a weapon as if it's loaded at all times. Like, you have to treat it with respect. So yeah, that's how I look at these things, and it's pretty serious, right? So yeah, 200 yards, almost 6 inches. You could be missing a headshot. When these errors start to magnify, if we're accepting, 4.5 to 5 inches at 200, what else are we accepting? How precise was our zero? Was our zero perfect, or was it good enough at distance, right? Or probably not at distance, because a lot of guys who do this, they're only shooting that rifle on paper at that near intersect, and they're never confirming at the far intersect, right? So they may think they're reasonably close to the center of that aiming point on the target, but if they pushed out the distance, they probably would have seen probably needs a little tweaking, a little click here or there. How precise are we with our head alignment through the optic? Because these red dot optics are not parallax free, and if they're not all equal, they're not all the same, they're not all constant different distances. Those are complete myths, and if you still subscribe to that myth, just swing on over to my website or Google my parallax study, Green Eye Tactical Red Dot Parallax or something like that. It'll come up. It's on the website too. It's an 84-page report that I did with a number of different data points that pretty demonstrably shows. And I've yet to have somebody come up and refute that with data yet. But yeah, check that out. So parallax is the thing. How much are we accepting with that? How bright is this dot? Right? Because the brighter the dot is, the larger bloom we're going to get and perceive. The more it's going to cover. It doesn't mean it's less precise, but it can cause difficulties with consistently referencing the target. Right? How much error are we accepting there? How much fundamental error are we applying? What about range estimation? What about winds? Right? All of those things are going to add and compound. So if you get in the frame of mind of accepting error, right? It's going to compound and it's going to make the end error bigger. And really, there's no reason for this, right? Because this is just data collection, right? Why would you accept error there, right? This doesn't really take a whole bunch of time, but whatever. You can map this stuff out. The math is there. So 200 yards, 4.64 inches, 250 yards, he was low 11.33 inches, and 300 yard, he was 21.3 inches, right? Now, I've got a plus or minus 3 inches here. Let me explain that. So the zero that I like to use, guys, is a custom zero, right? I'll do a point-blank range zero. The military refers to it as a battle site zero. It can also be referred to as a maximum point-blank range zero. And what that's doing is it's establishing a window that we want that round to pass through. I like to use 6 inches. I've seen people use like 8 inches or 12 inches. I like to use 6 inches because that's putting us in a legit headshot. Right, so 6 inches is pretty good. It's doable for the most part for most rifles. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with that initial intersect to where I can get the terminal ordinate or the maximum ordinate of the round, the highest it's going to get over my line of sight, to not exceed 3 inches. If it's like 3.08 on the calculator, I might let that fly because it'll be lower if I go the other way. But I want to get as close to that as possible. And the sight height is going to have a great effect on there. The higher your sight height is, generally the longer we can push out our maximum point-blank range for, right? Now, understanding, like I'm running a 3 3/4 inch height of a bore, of course, like right out of the barrel, it's out of tolerance for the 3 inches. My CQB holdover is different, but past there, it's within it. I can push it out farther. So where his was falling out of that 6 inch target, meaning, if it's a 6 inch plate, if I center hold, I don't want it higher than 3 inches. I don't want it lower than 3 inches because I'm missing, right? Assuming I make the shot perfectly. So he's getting out of that plus or minus 3 inches at 185 yards. Now, keep in mind, he had absolutely zero idea where these drops were. He had assumed that because he was told, and a lot of instructors on the internet had reinforced this, that, 5,200 is the way to go. You're going to be on at 200. He assumed that his rifle was going to be on at 200. Never shot it there before. Okay, now people can argue that whatever way, but you're putting that information out. You have to be careful because if you put information out, people are going to take it. So you have to be careful about the context at which you put out that information, right? If that was put out like, hey, 50 will be a good starting point. You might be reasonably close at 200, but you're going to have to check the velocities, confirm your drops on paper. You can't be reasonably certain. You are not zeroed at your far intersect until you confirm you're zero at your far intersect. And oh, by the way, hitting a 36 inch or 60 inch or whatever massive gong you've got at your range is not confirming you're zero, unless you've painted it and you've got a spotting scope and you can see exactly where those rounds are hitting, right? Usually, hey, you want to punch paper. Right, because we also want to confirm that we're grouping consistently without major error, because you don't want to re-zero your rifle to a bad shot group, because that's going to be a bad zero, right? So he didn't know. So he could have gotten into an engagement at that distance with the false perception of his weapon's capability and possibly made some bad shots and could have had some catastrophic results. That's why I get kind of worked up about this, and I keep driving it, right? Especially as instructors in the industry, we've got to be really careful about the information that we put out, because people are going to look to us for for information. They're going to consider you subject matter experts. Like, hey, these guys teach. They know what they're doing. He's an instructor. X instructor told me to do this, right? We've got to be real careful how we represent things, right? So, yeah, this guy, however he took it, and I don't know how it was explained to him. I don't want to say what instructor it was or anything like that, and I wasn't standing there for the conversation. So this is all, hearsay or whatever. But this is what how this guy perceived the information that was given to him through his department, that was relayed through another instructor, that, hey, 5,200, you can be on at 200. He thought he was on at 200. And beyond that, he also thought, because he was told, that you're going to be pretty close at 250 too. Almost 12 inches, right? I don't consider that pretty close, right? Remember, you got to get out of this whole minute of man thing. There's no reason for it with data, right? There's absolutely no reason for it. So here's what I did in kind of the process that I do. And if you want to see a breakdown of this, I'm not going to get too deep into it. The equipment that I use in my YouTube channel, there's a whole series. It's like 8 hours of video on Intro to the TAC Rifle. It's gonna be the last instructional video series that I ever do. After the last Dallas active shooter, I decided I'm not going to do any more instruction videos on the internet, just because that active shooter, he was browsing instructors' websites and properly used techniques to win a gunfight. Around the column outside of that university or college down there. So, I'm real careful about what I put out. I was actually on the fence about even doing this video, but I thought the juice was worth the squeeze. With some of the stuff I see with students and law enforcement guys showing up. So what I do is I'll throw all that data in there. I'm going to measure all the weather and atmospherics. We're going to do the critical measurements. I actually physically measure the height over bore using a square and stuff like that. We precisely measure that. We get as precise with the data as I can. If that bullet's information is going to be in the ballistics library that I'm using, I use it. If not, hey, we'll do some research and see if we can, either get the manufacturers or see if somebody's tested it, see if we can get something for it. We'll be as accurate as we can with all the data that we put in. I precisely measure the muzzle velocity, through a 10 rounds of measured shots, and plug all that stuff in. And try to be as accurate as we can with the data, because that only costs us 10 rounds. That's it, 10 rounds in a few minutes to collect that stuff, throw it in, and then we can see all that data represented. And from my experience doing this for over 5 years now, it's pretty on, right? I get really good results at distance, just with putting in good data. And then we just work on fundamentals. Makes it simpler, right? So we'll play around with that initial intersect of the zero until the terminal ordinate, right, the apogee of the round, doesn't exceed 3 inches over my line of sight. So when we played around with that, we figured out that at 32 yards, and I did him in yards because the LE ranges that he works out are in yards, and most people think in yards. I'll do meters for people who are shooting mill reticles or or in the military. They want to stick with meters. And we figured out that what that's going to do, it's going to change his maximum ordinate to 120 yards. So it's pushed out a little bit farther, and it was right at 3 inches. Right there. So, and that's one of the things I usually tell students, like you need to know at a minimum 3 offsets, right? You want to know obviously what distance you're zeroed at, because that's going to affect, hey, at what distances am I compensating for CQB holdover, right? Because when we're inside of our zero distance, the round's going to be lower than our line of sight. And then what distance is my max ordinate, right? Because if I do need to calculate a precise hold, if I know that I'm 3 inches high at 120 yards, I can favor slightly low if I'm kind of close to that, right? Inside of the 50% rule, inside of halfway between 32 and 120. If I'm past halfway towards 120, then I might favor slightly low, or if I'm at 120, I might, if I can distinguish 3 inches at 120 with my eyes unmagnified, then I'll do that, or past. And then I want to know where the bullet passes back through that 3-inch window, that point blank range 0. So where that does for his, and that should be a plus, not an equal sign there if you can see it, 225 yards. So we've changed, right? So he did have a maximum point blank range 0 for a 6-inch target. It's just he fell out of tolerance for that at 185 yards. Right now, we actually did the math on this too. If he'd done a 25-yard 0, he actually would have been over 3 inches, quite a bit. So that kept it down. But he was passing out of tolerance at 185 yards. When we did that 0 tweak, that pushed it out to 225 yards. Right, so at 225 yards and in, he could just center hold on ahead and he's good to go. Now with some better ammo, there's some issues with that ammo. I'm not a huge fan about. That would have been significantly longer, right? Especially the TSX rounds and stuff like that from Black Hills, the 5.56 loads out of a 14.5-inch barrel. I see quite a bit better velocities, and usually that maximum point blank range 0 on a 6-inch target is going to be right around 300 yards, and depending on the temperature, right? So at 200 yards now, he was at a 1/4 inch low as opposed to 4.64 inches low. At 250 yards, he was only 5.85 inches low as compared to 11 inches, right? So that's half, right? So that's going to be quite a bit closer to his point of aim. At 300 yards, he was 14.75 inches low as compared to 21.3. So hey, you guys that are center of mass shooters, a 14-inch drop is going to put you closer. If you're holding between shoulders here, a little bit closer to more vital areas than a 21.3 inch. Obviously, if we get too low, kind of here between the legs, then we've got some critical areas there, but that's not kind of the shot placement that we're looking for all the time. So there's quite a bit of a difference there, and that's why I think it's important to understand that all of your rifles are different, right? The zeros are going to be different, right? So we got to kind of be honest with the information that we're putting out. You can't say like all AR-15 should be 0 to 100. All AR-15 should be 0 to 50. No, I'm not buying it, right? So standardized zeros, right? They work-ish for standardized weapons, standardized sighting systems, standardized ammunition, standardized weather, right? Because weather's going to affect all that standardized stuff too, to some extent, right? I said ish because they're still all going to vary slightly, right? So when the DoD does this, we understand that manufacturing inconsistencies between barrels, there can be variances in lots of ammunition, can produce some different results. Barrel life, how much it's worn out, can affect things, the cleanliness of the rifle, all that stuff. So we're getting ish, right? Usually I could take like 5 brand new rifles from the same manufacturer, same barrel length, and they're all going to have slightly different average muzzle velocities, right? They're going to be close, but they're going to be slightly different. How much those differences matter is going to be subjective, right? You would have to ask yourself, what's my acceptable error? How much am I willing to accept? What I'd say is for these deterministic errors, errors that you can account for, right? Factors you can account for. Why accept error in that? It doesn't make any sense. The more accurate you are with the things that you can account for, the more accurate you're going to be with the things that you can't account for, because you're going to have less starting error, right? Whole Mel Gibson thing and the Patriot, aim small, miss small, right? If you accept a large aiming area, right, you're going to have a larger shot group than if you're not accepting a larger aiming small, right? It's the same thing with your data. If you're being more precise with it, you're not accepting things that you don't have to accept, then you're going to have better accuracy to begin with. So getting back to this, like, what zero should I use? Hey man, nobody can tell you, right? If an instructor tells you You should be zeroed at this distance. And he hasn't asked you a series of questions, right? Okay, what's your average muzzle velocity? What was the atmospherics at the time of collection? What are the critical measurements of your gun? What's the ballistic coefficient of the round? Blah, blah, blah. And actually does the math on it to figure it out. Look, it's going to be a strong statement. Either he doesn't know what he's talking about, or he is setting you up for their course of fire, their environment, which I get it. There's some instructors that are like, hey, I want you to zero it at 100, for this course, because the course of fire is 0 at 50, because this is where we're going to be testing at, and we're trying to focus on something else other than external ballistics. But bottom line, unless we're all shooting the same ammunition, which we're not, 5.56, all 5.56 is not the same. All 2.23 is not the same. That's not what standardized ammunition means with regards to our zeros, right? We're all shooting. We're not all shooting the same sighting systems. We're all in different areas, different climates, different weather, right? Your zeros are not going to be the same. They're just not. The better way to do that, if you're going to push a 50 or a 100, is be honest with it, right? Hey, understand that you guys aren't going to, not everybody gets out to 200, 300. So a 50 is going to could get you close at 200, right? Maybe you could call that a rule of thumb, but you can't call that a zero, right? Because you're only zeroed at the distance you confirm it, right? And a lot of shooters, there are guys who do shoot out at distance, are not producing groups with sufficient precision to be able to confirm a drop at 300 on paper, right? Especially when we're talking about like our ARs, our red dot optics, and things like that, right? You guys that are prone scope shooters and precision shooters and stuff like that, and hey, they're pulling off sub-minute angle groups out at distance. That's fine, but the reality for a lot of the guys in the tactical community, man, they're standing in front of the target at 7 yards and blasting. The farthest they might shoot out is their zero distance, or their testing distance. So, having some good data behind that is pretty important. And if you're not, really studying and grouping and working really hard on your fundamentals, it's going to be difficult for you to produce a shot group that's going to be tight and consistent enough at 200 or 300 for you to, number one, be able to true your ballistic coefficient, true your ballistics, but also to correct off of. Hey, if you see more of it over to the left or right, could I tweak it in? Yes, but if you've got a large shot group, a mean point of impact, right, where you perceive the center of that group may not be the right 0 point based off of how that error's producing on target, right? You can easily make a bad sight correction off of that. So data's pretty important, right? And that's why I think you got to be really careful about how you characterize some of these zeros that are going to be put out. Like if you're going to say, hey, 5200 is good for ARs, maybe say, hey, you'll be on at 50. You might be close at 200, but understand your ballistics could be different. For sure, 25-300, you're going to be quite a bit different, right? Depending on what you're running. We're all different. We all need to accept that, right? All of our rifle setups, all of our ammunition, all of our weather is going to be different. Your zeros are going to be different, right? Stuff to think about. So the other thing to think about is for what zero is going to be right for you, or what are your purposes, right? Because I'll hear guys going like, oh, this is too much for first-time shooters. Well, hey, I don't think it's right to limit information to first-time shooters or make them earn it, right? Put out the right information for them, right? You don't have to over-inundate them with information. I tried to keep this as broad as possible. There's quite a bit more depth that you can go into a lot of this stuff, and there's probably guys watching this video that know a lot of this stuff, right? And I've tried to kind of keep it on the surface as much as I can. But let them decide what's going to be right. And you're also helping educate the newer generation of shooters or first-time shooters, that are going to, join our industry here with good information. And it's going to help myths from being perpetuated, right? Like these standardized zeros that will not die because people keep pushing them, and guys who have never, been to a class or, never done the data on them, they think that that is correct, and they will argue it, like their life depends on it, because we tend to get emotionally attached to equipment or ideas or different instructors, because we get into the kind of fanboy culture, right? It's kind of like a sports team. Like, hey, you might like the Dallas Cowboys, for whatever emotional reasons, even though the data and statistics don't support their superiority. I'm in Texas, so I'll probably get some hate mail over that. I don't follow football anyways. It's weird. So yeah, we got to think about that, because they'll argue it and they'll perpetuate it, and you can't have a logical conversation with them because they've never been shown the reason or the data behind it. We should be able to have an emotional, unemotional, and rational conversation about things like this, because it's data, right? It's not really preference. Preference, like I prefer this or prefer that. That's neither here nor there. What you could say is, I don't know if you can see that, your purpose, right? It's not I prefer this, right? That has no meaning. Like what? Like your emotions don't factor into this. Hey, this works better for my purposes. This is why, right? Hey, I'm just target shooting at this distance. That's why I'm using that, right? Or hey, based off of the acceptable aiming area of the game that I'm going after, this is okay. I'm fine with this. Or, hey, I can't do this or that. Whatever, right? Now we can have a conversation about that on the merits of it. Like, oh, hey, I get what you're doing. Okay, I understand, right? Your environment. What's best for your environment, right? We can have a discussion about that. That's a fact base to go off of. What's best for your weapon? All of our weapons are different, right? And that could drive towards our purposes, right? Your optic, right? Like, hey, maybe you're shooting a 1 in 6 or a 1 in 8 low power variable optic with a semi Christmas tree reticle on that, and that's why you zeroed at 100. Because it matches best to my subtensions. Or, hey, maybe you've got a different kind of exotic distance, because you've gone and played with those numbers and you've figured out a specific zero distance where you're going to get the most subtensions to drop to distance on those graduations of your reticle. Because I have had guys done that. They've played around with there and figured out that they can get the 20 or 50 yard distance gates for their drops to match up to their reticle drops. That's fine. We can have a conversation about that. That's no worries. Or your ammunition, right? Hey, the other nice thing about with especially law enforcement guys, horny tap guys running out of SBRs, running ballistics collection off that will also give you a prediction of where the velocity is going to fall underneath a very important number, which is the minimum expansion velocity threshold. Most manufacturers will for expanding ammunition or defensive rounds, and whatnot, they're going to have an advertised velocity. And usually, if they're honest, it's going to be a window, kind of a band of velocity, where if it falls underneath that, it goes slower, it's not going to expand. It can risk overpenetration, right? So that's something to consider as well, because that could feed into the mental calculus as to whether or not a shot is appropriate, because if a round's going to excessively overpenetrate due to lower velocity, because it's not expanding, it's retaining more pressure per square inch, it's just going to zip right through somebody based off the complication of your background of the shot that you're taking, for LE guys or SWAT guys, that may be a consideration, right? So that's kind of what I'm driving at. I just want to throw out some facts, some data here, and it is what it is. Hey, you might agree with it, you might not agree with it. And one thing I do want to say, like, if you're going to another instructor's course, right, you've got to play by house rules, right? If whatever instructor you're going to wants you to be zeroed at 50 yards or wants you to be zeroed at 100 yards, he's not going to care what I said. He's not going to care what any other instructor said, right? To some extent, you just got to play by house rules, right? You could, maybe try to have a conversation with him about it, but if he doesn't want to have a conversation about it, it is what it is. Usually at my courses, it's not going to be a my way or the highway thing. I'll talk to you about it. I'll explain it about it. I've never used my credentials or background to justify something that I teach. I try to have a good understanding of what I'm doing about it, of what I'm doing, and the reasons behind it. And there's guys that understand this stuff a lot better than I do too. This is something that I had to figure out when I got out of the military and started teaching open training courses, because you go from everybody's running the same stuff to, man, you go to a class and it'll just be a bag of potato chips. You're going to have all kinds of different rifles, optics, ammunition, and especially if you're trying to push out the distance, because in my TAC rifle fundamentals course, I'll take first-time shooters out past 600 yards easily on second day, just through good data. And if I was just using these standardized zeros, that wouldn't happen unless I'm walking rounds into a target with a spotting scope, and that's not what I'm trying to do. Like, I want guys to be able to trust their data, identify their holds, hold their holds, pull the trigger without inducing any error, and hit the target, period. And I'd never be able to do that if I was doing a standardized zero. I just wanted to kind of throw some thoughts out about that. Hey, feel free to toss in some comments here, or start a conversation about it. I'll interact as I can. I get some time here. But again, try to have it fact based. Try to have it logic based. Your preferences, your feelings, what somebody else said doesn't really come into it. Don't trust what I said. Like, hey, man, you go do your own research. There's lots of good articles and stuff about this. Go out and test your ammunition. Right? Maybe it matters for you. Maybe it doesn't. Come up with a solution. Come up with the answers on your own. Trust but verify, or don't trust and verify. Whatever you want. You should always have a mindset of critical thinking, right? Not that you're just doubting everything, but you're verifying it. You're always looking for flaws in plans, right? Making sure things make sense. Because if something is valid, it should be able to stand up to scrutiny and criticism, right? It should. It's just like when people got emotional when I made that announcement, about banning the T1 optic from my TAC rifle fundamentals course. People lost their minds, like I kicked their dog, right? So I said, okay, well, hey, criticize that. Of course, there's no data behind the criticism. It was just personal attacks and stuff. We did a study, put out the results. And it's out there. Have a conversation about data and facts, right? The bullet doesn't care about your emotions, doesn't care about your preferences. It's an inanimate object that is subject to the laws of physics and data over feelings, right? So, sorry that was long, but hey, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up, and stay safe, train hard, and have a good one.